It has been 15 years since that stagecoach rolled into Silverdale with the dust of 3 counties stitched to its canvas and a driver who spoke more to his horses than to men. 15 years seems like a long trail when you say it out loud, though most days it feels like a breath caught in winter air, visible and gone. I can still smell that moment. The wheels ground to a stop and the wind shifted, and there it was, faint but stubborn, a line of lavender riding over sweat and leather. I had read her letters by lamplight all winter, careful as a man handling thin glass. I knew the lilt of her words. I did not know the bruise I would meet. I was waiting by the hitching post with my hat brim pulled low. Morning had been stingy with its light. The sun hung back behind the ridge as if it feared the town. Silverdale was quiet, the kind of quiet you get right before a storm or a wedding. I held a second cup of coffee in my hands, cool and quick in the spring air, because I had not known what to do with them. I am better with fences and foals. Hands understand their work then. Waiting is a different labor. The door of that coach stuck and then kicked open. She stepped down slow, one gloved hand on the rail, the other carrying a small satchel that had worked loose at the seams. Her veil was plain, the color of ash. I saw the edge of it flutter. Then the wind did what the wind always does out here. It told the truth. It lifted the cloth enough for a sliver of her face to show, and in that thin window of morning, I caught the bloom of yellow and blue high on her cheek, the kind of color a man does not earn chopping wood. The world narrowed. I set the coffee on the ground. "Zoe," I said, and her name felt careful in my mouth, like a newborn colt in a cold barn. She startled, not at her name, but at the sound of a voice saying it soft. I guess she was used to voices that arrived like doors slamming. Her eyes were green, the pale kind that find light and keep it. She held my look for a heartbeat, then glanced down the street as if the town itself might rise up against her. Something inside me stepped forward before my boots did. "You're not alone now," I told her. Those words came up from a place deeper than a thought. They were a promise that had been waiting, maybe for years, for a mouth to climb out of. I did not mean them to sound like a vow, but vows have their own minds. The driver tossed her another small bag and spit, and asked if I was the husband. I told him I was the man taking her home. He grinned at the word. Folks have all kinds of homes in their heads. A roof is a roof. A room is not always a room. We had written about simple things: weather, books, the taste of bread when you bake it yourself and let it go a minute too long, how the sky can look like water when the wind is wrong. I had not written about the grave on the hill. I had not written about 8 winters that moved through my chest and left it hollow as a canteen after a drive. Some losses you keep in the pocket, near your heart. The quiet knows the shape of them without you having to say it. She offered her hand, and I did not take it at first. There are rules to meeting a frightened animal and a frightened person. The first rule is not to crowd. The second is to make your movements small and honest. I tipped my hat. She tipped her chin. Her glove trembled just enough to let the morning know we were all 3 alive. The sheriff crossed the street slow, boots loud because he wanted them to be. He had the look of a man who knows everybody's weight and the price of wheat in the same thought. He asked me later that day if I had seen the note. I told him I had not, because I had not then. Notes have a way of finding their readers in their own time. We walked to my wagon, and I loaded her bags with the same care I used for seed. One strap had been mended with thread that did not match. She watched me like a person measuring distance. When I climbed up, she sat beside me, but not close. Hands folded white in her lap. The veil stayed where it was. I did not ask for it to move. The reins felt good and plain in my palms. The team leaned into the pull, and the wagon gave that low groan a man likes to hear because it means the wood is honest. Silverdale fell behind us, one clapboard building at a time. The road out of town snakes along the creek, and in spring the willows look like they want to remember the shape of the wind. She did not speak for a mile. When she did, her voice surprised me. It was not thin. It was steady with a tired edge, a fence line after a blizzard. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I said I would," I told her. She turned a little, just enough that I could see the bruise again through the curtain of cloth. There was a small cut on her lower lip, healing in the careful way that cuts do when they have not been given time. I kept my eyes on the road. A man can look kind and still look like he's weighing a thing he has no right to weigh. I have spent much of my life letting the land tell me what it needs. It asks plain. People ask with their eyes. "There's a room ready for you," I said. "You can rest there. No one will bother you. Not me, not anybody. The door locks. The key is yours." Her shoulders slackened the width of a finger. It was small, but out here small things are often the size of mercy. I told her about the stove that sticks and the window that sticks more and the rooster that thinks the moon is his business. She almost smiled at that. Almost can be a good start. Halfway to the ranch, the wind went cold and sharp. She shivered and pulled her coat closer. I set the brake and told her I had a heavier blanket in the back. When I reached for it, I found the small envelope tucked in the seam of her satchel. It had no address, just a tight hand and a line that said she was better off dead than found. I knew a man's hand when I saw one. I knew a threat when it dressed itself up as concern. I folded the envelope and slid it back where it had been. Then I took the blanket forward and set it between us. I did not drape it over her. I do not drape anything over anyone who has been covered against their will. She took it after breath and laid it across her lap with that careful steadiness again. I started the team, and we rolled on. The country opens up after the last bend. My place sits on a rise that looks toward a long strip of grassland where the light likes to lie down in late afternoon. The house is honest plank and stubborn stone, built one payday at a time. A barn, a corral, a windmill that sings in its own off-key. I had swept the porch that morning twice without needing to. You can always tell when a man is expecting company by the state of his porch. When we pulled in, the dogs came and sniffed and wagged with that sudden belief animals have in new beginnings. I told them to hush, and they hushed because we have known each other a while. I helped Zoe down only when she offered her hand. The bruise had deepened in the day's thin light. She looked at the house like it was a place that might choose her back. "It is small," I said, "but it holds the weather well." She nodded. The porch boards complained. The door swung the way new doors do, a little proud of themselves. I showed her the room to the right, the one that gets the softest morning. The bed was plain pine, the quilt stitched by a neighbor who sews like she argues, fierce and straight. On the dresser, I had laid a comb and a bar of soap and a small blue ribbon I found in town because the storekeep said women like ribbon even when they do not use it. Men buy the wrong color, he told me. I bought 3. This is yours, I said. All of it is yours to keep or refuse. She set her satchel on the bed and kept her gloves on. The room took her in the way a good room does, quietly, without questions. I stepped back to the hall and kept my boots on the threshold. If you are hungry, I said, there's stew left from last night. If you would rather rest, I will leave you be. Supper is when you say it is. She looked at me. Not through me. Not around me. At me. The veil had slipped off her hair and found her shoulder. The bruise told its story and then stopped as if it trusted me to hear the rest in silence. I'm very tired, she said. No, all right. I left her then, and I did not listen at the door. In the kitchen, the stove fought me same as always before it remembered my hand. I put the kettle on and waited for water to think about boiling. On the table lay the pen I had used to write her in the tin of matches with a picture of a river on it. I struck one and watched it catch, bright and fast. Sometimes a man prays without words. That was one of those times. That first night, the house listened harder than I did. You can tell when walls are holding their breath. Every sound settles different when there's someone new under your roof. The wind found the cracks in the window frame and whistled low, like it was trying to remind me that quiet is a kind of company. I sat at the table long after the kettle stopped steaming, cup cold in my hands, staring at the fire's slow dance. She did not come out for supper. I left a bowl of stew by the door with a loaf of bread that had gone hard around the edges. In the morning, the bowl was empty, the bread gone, and the spoon washed clean, set back beside the sink. That told me enough. You don't always need words to hear someone breathing again. The next day started with frost that didn't belong to spring. I saddled the mare and rode out to check the fence line. Same as always, the sun climbed slow, warm enough to fool the ground but not the bones. By noon, the air softened, and when I came back, the smoke from the chimney told me she had found the stove's temper. Through the window I saw her sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair braided loose and pinned low. She was sweeping the floor, each motion careful, like she didn't want to wake the boards. I almost knocked before stepping in, but this was my house. And then again, it wasn't just mine anymore. I hope you don't mind, she said, not turning around. I don't mind. I couldn't sit still. I reckon sitting still ain't good for either of us. She stopped sweeping and leaned the broom against the wall. The morning light caught the bruise on her cheek, fading now, yellow soft as corn silk. The cut on her lip was a thin pink memory. I saw her notice me seeing, and for a moment she straightened her back, ready to hide again. It's healing, I said, meaning both of us. She nodded. It'll take a little while. Most things worth keeping do. That was the first time she smiled, small and sideways, like she didn't trust the feeling yet. It reached her eyes, but stopped halfway, hovering there, unsure of the distance between us. I showed her the corral, the barn, the water pump that squeaks but never quits. The dogs followed, tails like metronomes, keeping time with our silence. She touched the fence rail, the rough cedar, the flakes of old paint catching the light. I told her about the mare named Clementine who kicks at shadows and the calf that won't nurse from anything but a bucket. By afternoon, She asked if she could help. I told her there was no rush. She said, "Doing something helps me remember I'm still here." I handed her a basket of eggs to collect from the hens. She took it like it was a fragile truth. While she worked, I split wood near the shed. Every few swings, I'd glance up. The sight of her there in the yard, skirt brushing dust, hair catching sun, had a way of making the world slow down to a bearable pace. You live alone long enough, you forget the shape of gentleness until it moves through your doorway. At dusk we shared supper, quiet as church. She ate slow, not dainty, just measuring trust in small bites. I told her about the years before her letters, how the ranch had grown out of stubbornness and borrowed luck. She listened with both hands around her cup, the kind of listening that makes a man careful with his words. When she spoke, her voice carried a tremor, but not fear, just the echo of too much silence. My mother used to read by the fire. She said stories could keep you warm when the wood ran out. She was right, I said. Fire fades. Words hold longer. She nodded and looked toward the window. Outside, night had pulled its blanket tight over the plains. "It's beautiful out here," she said, "so open it almost hurts." "That's the West for you," I told her. "I don't give, it don't take, it just waits to see who stays." Later, when I banked the fire and she went to her room, I found that envelope again. It had slipped from her satchel onto the shelf. The handwriting stared back at me like a snake coiled and patient. I thought about burning it, thought about reading it. In the end, I did neither. I slid it into the drawer and told myself there'd be time enough to face what it held. Days turned to a kind of rhythm. She rose early, before the rooster's false dawn, and the house began to sound like a home again. The windows opened for the first time in years. Curtains breathed. Bread baked. I'd hear her humming sometimes, soft and uncertain, like a tune she half remembered. I fixed the pump handle, mended the fence near the stream, and built a new gate that didn't lean with the wind. It felt strange, having purpose beyond the shape of my own solitude. And the land seemed to notice, too. The cattle moved easier, the dogs barked less. Even the river behind the barn ran quieter, as if it approved. One afternoon, I came in from the field and found her reading by the window. Sunlight caught in her hair. The book was one I hadn't opened since my wife passed. She looked up, saw the hesitation on my face, and closed it gently. "I can put it back," she said. "No need," I answered. "Books don't belong to ghosts." She studied me a moment. "Do you still talk to her?" "Sometimes," I said, "when the wind comes from the north. She always liked the smell of snow." Zoe didn't press. She just nodded, eyes soft, and looked back to the page. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a man divided between memory and daylight. That night, the rain came, thin at first, then steady. The roof kept its word mostly. She stepped into the kitchen with a blanket around her shoulders. I was stirring the fire. "You ever get used to it?" she asked. "Rain?" "No. Feeling safe." I let the question sit between us, crackling with the wood. "No," I said finally. "You don't get used to it. You just learn not to flinch when it happens." She smiled at that, small but sure, and poured 2 cups of coffee. We drank in silence while the thunder rolled over the hills. Somewhere deep in the noise, something inside both of us unclenched a little. In the morning, the world smelled new. The soil was dark and ready. She stepped outside barefoot, laughing once when the mud caught her toes. "That sound," Short, surprised, honest, was the kind of miracle no preacher could sell. I leaned on the porch rail, watching her turn her face to the sun. That was when I realized I'd started waiting for her laughter, the way a man waits for rain in August, not as a cure, but as proof that the world hadn't forgotten how to give. A week after the rain, the sheriff rode up the trail with dust in his wake and something in his eyes that didn't belong to a friendly visit. The dogs barked once, then backed off. Zoe was hanging laundry, the white cloth snapping sharp in the wind. I saw her freeze before I even heard him call my name. "Nathaniel," he said, reining in. "Need a word?" I met him halfway, boots sinking in the damp earth. His horse snorted, uneasy, catching what was between us. "She's been here near 2 weeks now," he said. "She has. You know, there's a man asking around. Claims to be her guardian, from Boston. Says she ran off with family property that ain't hers." I kept my hands at my sides. "That right?" "He's the kind that makes trouble look tidy. Says he's got papers. I told him we don't move on words alone out here." The sheriff looked past me toward the house. "Still, I'd keep close watch. He aims to ride this way soon." "I'll see to it," I said. He nodded, tugged his hat, and turned back down the road. Dust swallowed him before his words stopped echoing. When I faced the house again, Zoe was standing still among the clotheslines, a sheet between us like a ghost listening in. Her hands were tight around a clothespin. "He found me," she said quietly. "Maybe," I told her. "Maybe he just thinks he did." Her shoulders trembled, and I saw the fight rise in her before the fear. "If he comes here, I won't go back." "You won't," I said. "Not while I've got breath." That night, she didn't eat. I sat on the porch, watching the dark roll over the plains. Somewhere out there was a man with her name written on his anger, and I wanted nothing more than to be the distance that anger couldn't cross. The stars came early, cold and bright, and I told myself no harm finds its way easy through a sky like that. In the days that followed, she worked harder, like motion itself could outpace memory. The bruise was gone, but her eyes still carried its shadow. I tried to keep things ordinary, mending tack, oiling hinges, talking to the cows like old friends. She joined me in the fields, sleeves rolled, sunlight on her skin. It felt almost peaceful, like the world was pretending for our sake. Then one afternoon, as I was fixing the fence by the creek, I saw her standing near the apple tree with a letter in her hand. I didn't ask how it got there. The look on her face said it didn't matter. She came toward me slow, wind catching her hair, eyes fixed on something far away. "He says he'll come for me," she whispered. He says you're harboring stolen blood." I took the letter, folded it once, and slid it into my coat. "Then we'll make sure he finds nothing worth taking." Zoe stared at me a long while, then said, "You don't have to do this." "I know," I said. "That's why it means something." The next few nights carried a strange stillness. Even the crickets sounded cautious. I kept the rifle near the door, but never loaded it. Protection ain't always about bullets. Sometimes it's about being steady enough that fear has no place to sit. She began writing again, small notes folded into her Bible, words I glimpsed but never read. Every morning I'd find a flower left on the table, wild lavender from the ridge, the same scent that first told me she was real. I started to think maybe healing comes dressed like habit. One evening, she asked me if I believed people could start over. I told her the truth. No one starts over. We just keep walking until what hurt us can't keep up a nod. She looked at me like she wanted to believe that was enough. When the man finally arrived, he didn't come at dawn like cowards do. He came at noon, when the sun burns truth into everything it touches. A tall figure in a city coat, horse slick with sweat, dust up to his knees. He dismounted slow, hat shadowing a sharp face that had never missed a meal. "You've got something of mine," he said. "Can't say I do," I answered. "I'm speaking of Miss Caldwell." "She's her own name here," I told him, "and her own choosing." He smiled thin, mean. "You think you can hide her on this patch of dirt?" I didn't move. "I don't hide folks. I offer them doors that lock from the inside." His eyes flicked to the house. "You're making a mistake, rancher." "Made plenty," I said. "No, this one ain't yours to judge." He shifted his weight, maybe thinking I'd step back. I didn't. The air between us felt carved from stone. Behind me, the screen door creaked, and Zoe stepped out. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wore no veil, no fear. The sun hit her face and turned her eyes to clear water. "You have no claim on me," she said. Her voice was steady. "No paper can make a man out of you." The color drained from his skin. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "Maybe," she said, "but I'll regret it free." He stared a moment longer, weighing pride against distance. Then he swung up on his horse and rode off, anger clattering louder than hooves. I watched until the dust swallowed him whole. Zoe stayed by the porch rail, breathing like she just surfaced from a long dive. I walked over and took the note she still held, the last of his letters. I tore it once, twice, let the pieces scatter into the wind. She looked up at me, eyes bright with something new. "What now?" "Now," I said, "when we live the days we bought." That night, she lit the lamp herself and left the door to her room open. It wasn't an invitation, not the kind men talk about. It was trust, plain and hard-earned. I sat by the fire, listening to the boards settle, the dogs sigh, the wind hum through the grass. I thought about how easy it is to mistake silence for peace, and how different they really are. Peace makes room. Silence just waits. For the first time in a long while, I felt room enough for both of us. In the morning, she joined me on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. Steam rose between us, thin as hope, strong as habit. She looked out toward the fields. "It's quiet," she said. "It's alive," I told her, and the way she smiled then, tired, brave, unbroken, made the whole wide West feel just a little smaller, and maybe for once, kind. Spring stayed longer that year, like the land itself didn't want to turn loose of the calm that had found us. The creek ran full and clear, and the grass came up fast enough to make the cattle look lazy. I mended fences, she tended the garden, and together we learned the small music of quiet work. There were no more letters, no more riders from the east, just days that opened honest and closed soft. Sometimes I'd catch her humming that tune again, the one she never finished. It would float out of the kitchen window while she kneaded dough, slow and steady, like she was stitching her life back together one note at a time. I never asked what song it was. Some things lose their power when you name them. Every evening, we'd walk the ridge above the pasture. She liked the view from up there, the sweep of the valley, the way the sun poured itself into the grass until the whole world looked like it was burning slow. She said it made her feel small in a good way. I knew what she meant. The West does that to a soul. It reminds you how big forgiveness has to be if it's going to fit inside a human heart. One night, she stopped on the ridge and asked, "Do you ever think about leaving?" "Leaving what?" "All this." She waved a hand toward the horizon, starting somewhere new. "I already started new," I told her. "Right here." She smiled, but her eyes stayed on the line where sky met land. I think I used to run so far ahead of myself that I forgot what standing still felt like. "Standing still ain't the same as being stuck," I said. "Sometimes it's the only way to find out if you're safe." She nodded slow, taking that in, and we stood there until the light slipped away and the first star blinked awake. That summer the fields grew thick and green. The air smelled of rain and soil and something sweet I couldn't name. She started keeping a journal, writing each night by the lamp, small letters in a hand that had steadied over time. I never read it, never asked to. Whatever she was putting on those pages wasn't for me, not yet. Maybe not ever. It was enough just knowing she had words again. Once, when I came in from the barn late, I saw her asleep at the table, pen still in her hand. The lamplight made a halo out of her hair, and for a second I felt that ache, the one that reminds you life's fragile, that it could all slip quiet as smoke. I set a blanket over her shoulders and blew out the lamp, watching the dark settle gentle around her. The next morning she laughed at herself for falling asleep there. It was a small laugh, but it stayed in the air, warm and stubborn. By August, folks in town had stopped whispering. They saw her sometimes at the store or the church. Head held steady, smile quick but real. The women nodded. The men looked away, unsure what to make of a woman who carried her own peace like a badge. Sheriff stopped by one afternoon just to say he'd heard the man from Boston had gone back east, angry and empty. "Some folks," he said, "don't know what to do when a chain breaks." He tipped his hat to Zoe and rode off. She watched him go, then turned to me with that quiet certainty in her face. "It's over," she said. "Over," I agreed. But the truth was, endings out here aren't sharp. They fade like trails in the rain. When the harvest came, she insisted on helping. She carried baskets heavier than she should have, hands raw, unsmiling anyway. We filled the cellar till it looked like a promise kept. Sacks of grain, jars of peaches, rows of what patience can earn. That night, over supper, she asked, "Do you ever wonder why we survived what we did?" "Every day," I said. "Guess the trick is to keep wondering." She leaned back, eyes on the fire. "My mother used to say, God doesn't fix broken things. He makes them into something else. Maybe that's what we are, something else." I thought about that long after she went to bed. The fire cracked low, throwing shadows against the walls, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the house didn't sound like it was listening for danger. It just breathed. Autumn came easy. The wind turned cooler. The leaves fell slow, and the air carried that smell of wood smoke that always makes a man think about what he's built and what he's lost. Zoe took to wearing my old coat when she fed the hens. It hung too big on her, sleeves rolled, but she said it made her feel safe. One evening, she stood in the doorway, coat button wrong, hair loose, and said, "You know, this place used to feel like hiding. Now it feels like home." "Maybe it's both," I said. Sometimes home is just where you stop running. She looked at me a long time, the firelight catching the gold in her eyes, and something unspoken passed between us. It wasn't sudden, more like the quiet turning of a page that's been waiting to be read. Winter crept in early that year. The mornings bit at your lungs and the nights came on fast. We moved through it like we'd always been two people built for the same storm. She'd read by the fire and might sit near, sharpening tools that didn't need sharpening. The silence between us was full of words that didn't need saying. One night, she closed her book, folded her hands in her lap, and said, "Nathaniel, do you ever think about what comes next?" "Next?" She smiled. "After all this peace, after the healing?" "I don't know," I said. "I figure peace is work like any other. You keep tending it or it runs wild." She reached across the table, fingertips brushing mine. "Then I guess we'll keep tending." That touch was light, but it carried the weight of every quiet promise we'd built since that dusty morning in Silverdale. When she went to bed, I sat there a while longer, listening to the wind whistle through the chimney. I thought about the years behind me and the ones ahead, about how sometimes love doesn't roar, it just stays. I didn't know then that by spring she'd be carrying our first child, or that I'd stand one day on that same ridge holding a daughter who'd open her eyes to the wide western sky and call it home. All I knew was the sound of her laughter in the next room and how it filled every empty space the world had left in me. The winter after that was the kind that pressed on a man's bones and made the walls creak like they were tired of standing. Snow came early, heavy and quiet, blanketing the pasture till the fences vanished beneath it. We burned through half the firewood by Christmas, and still the cold found its way in. But she was warm. I could see it in her cheeks, the color of sunrise on frost. There was life growing in her, though we didn't speak of it at first. Some things need silence to take root. I noticed it one morning while she was hanging laundry inside by the stove, the air thick with steam. Her hands paused, one over her stomach just for a second. She caught me watching and smiled, like she'd been holding that smile in reserve for years. "It's real then?" I asked. She nodded. "Real as the snow outside." I didn't trust my voice right away. I just reached out and rested my palm over hers. The world felt smaller, safer. The house, the land, the ghosts, all of it narrowed down to that single touch and the heartbeat beneath her fingers. After that, every day felt like the first page of something we hadn't dared to hope for. I built a cradle from leftover pine boards, planed and sanded till the wood was smooth enough for a dream to rest on. She knitted tiny socks, blue and gray, though we didn't know which color the child would need. "Let the world decide," she said. Her laughter came easier then. The walls learned the sound of it, carried it from room to room. Even the dogs seemed lighter, tails wagging for no reason at all. When the storms came, we rode them out together. She'd sit by the fire reading aloud from whatever book she could reach, voice steady over the wind. Sometimes she'd stop and listen, head tilted, and I'd realize she wasn't listening to the storm at all. She was listening to her own breathing, to the rhythm of the life she was making. One night, the wind hit hard enough to rattle the shutters. I went to check the barn, coat pulled tight, lantern swinging. The air was sharp enough to bite. When I came back in, she was at the window, watching the snow fall thick against the glass. "It's strange," she said softly, how quiet it is when everything's alive beneath it. That's winter's secret, I told her. It covers the world, so we remember to wait. She turned, that light from the fire catching her face, and said, "Then I guess we'll wait together." The months passed slow, each one a small miracle. The baby moved beneath her ribs like a whisper from the future. I'd feel those tiny kicks against my hand and wonder how something so small could shift the weight of a whole world. When the thaw finally came, the river broke loose with a roar that shook the windows. She went into labor that same night. It was a long night, full of waiting and whispered prayers, the kind of prayers that don't ask for much, just mercy and breath. At dawn, when the first light spilled through the window, a cry filled the house. Not loud, just sure. I'd heard thunder, gunfire, the wail of coyotes in the dark, but nothing ever split me open like that sound. She was small, our daughter, with hair the color of wheat and fists that refused to unclench. Zoe held her close, tears tracing the curve of her smile. "What will we call her?" I asked. "Amelia," she said, "for my mother." "Amelia," I repeated, the name rough in my throat but right. "Welcome home, little one." Outside, the sun pushed over the ridge, bright and golden. The light fell across them, mother and child, and for a moment I forgot every cold winter, every silence, every scar. There was just that room, that light, and the two hearts beating beside mine. I stepped outside while they slept. The air smelled of thaw and earth. The trees dripped with the slow music of melting snow. I walked down to the river, the same one that had carried her scent to me all those years ago, and let the sound of it wash through me. For the first time in a long life, I didn't feel like a man standing guard against the past. I felt like a man being allowed to stay. When I came back, Zoe was awake, the baby at her breast. She looked up tired and radiant. "She's hungry," she said, as if it were the best news the world had ever offered. "She gets that from you," I said. She laughed, and that laugh carried over the crib, over the stove, out through the open window, and into the morning. I swear the whole valley could hear it, and maybe it needed to. That night, after I'd rocked Amelia to sleep, I sat by the fire and traced the grain of the cradle. The flames cracked, shadows bending like slow dancers. I thought about all the nights that had brought us here, the stagecoach, the bruise, the fear, the waiting, and how each one had been its own kind of road. Zoe came behind me, wrapped in a blanket, hair loose around her shoulders. "You're thinking too loud," she said, resting her chin on my shoulder. "Can't help it," I said. "Feels like if I stop, I might forget how far we've come." She kissed my cheek, soft and certain. "Don't worry, I'll remember for both of us." Outside, the wind turned warm, the stars blinked over the ridge, and somewhere in the dark, a coyote called. A long, lonely sound that didn't feel lonely anymore. I held her hand until the fire burned down to embers, the kind that glow steady and low, not gone, just resting. And for the first time, I knew that was what love really was. Not a flame to chase, but a light you tend, slow and sure, through every kind of weather. The years that followed blurred together in the way good years often do. Not because nothing happened, but because everything that did was worth keeping. Amelia grew with the seasons, fast and wild as the grass after rain. By her second summer, she could toddle across the porch on her own, chasing dust motes like they were butterflies. Her laughter had the same tone as her mother's, a sound that could mend a man without him knowing he'd been torn. Zoe took to motherhood like she'd been waiting her whole life for permission to be gentle. She moved through the days quiet but sure, teaching the child the language of wind and water, how to listen for the difference between a storm coming and a storm passing. I'd watch them sometimes from the barn door, Zoe kneeling in the garden, Amelia beside her, a tangle of curls and sunlight, and I'd feel that ache again, the one that's half gratitude and half disbelief. The ranch grew too. We added another barn, mended the well, traded calves for seed. Neighbors began stopping by more often, bringing pies or tools to borrow. For a long time after Zoe arrived, folks in Silverdale had kept their distance, unsure of our story. But stories change with time, and ours had softened into something folks could understand. A man, a woman, a child, and the work between them. Sheriff came by one evening with a new deputy, a boy barely old enough to shave. "Thought I'd check in on your piece," he said. "It's holding," I told him. He grinned. "Looks like it's thriving." When they left, Zoe stood on the porch with Amelia in her arms, watching the trail of dust behind the horses. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked. "Which one?" "The one when he came. The man from Boston, huh?" "Sometimes," I said, "mostly when I'm grateful he didn't stay." She smiled. "Funny how the worst things can lead you home." I looked at her then, hair caught in the wind, child at her hip, and I knew there wasn't a preacher alive who could put better truth into words. By autumn, Amelia was walking steady and talking in that soft tumble of words children invent for themselves. She called the chickens peeps and the dogs woofs, and she thought the moon was something her mother hung up each night. Zoe would laugh until she cried, and I'd stand there, useless and blessed. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sky turn to copper, Amelia climbed into my lap and traced the scar on my jaw with her tiny finger. "Papa, did that hurt?" she asked. "Once," I said. "Not anymore." Zoe looked up from her sewing. "Scars don't always mean pain, sweetheart," she told her. "Sometimes they mean we healed." Amelia nodded, satisfied, and leaned against me until she fell asleep. I carried her inside, laid her in the cradle I'd built, and stood there longer than I needed to. There's a weight to peace, a good kind, but heavy all the same. That winter brought more snow, but it didn't feel as cruel. The fire stayed warm, the roof stayed strong, and the laughter never left the rooms. Zoe began reading again after supper, her voice weaving through the quiet like thread through cloth. Amelia would sit wide-eyed, soaking up every word, her head resting against her mother's arm. I'd listen too, pretending to whittle, though most times the knife just hovered above the wood. One night she read from a book about distant places, oceans, cities, lights that never go out. When she finished, she looked up and said, "Do you ever miss the world beyond these hills?" I thought about it, about the years I'd spent chasing horizons that never promised anything back. "No," I said, "the world's right here. Just took me a while to see it." She smiled, eyes soft. Took me longer. After she went to bed, I stepped outside into the cold. The moon hung low and full, lighting the snow till it looked like silver cloth stretched to the edge of forever. I thought about how small we were beneath it, and how, somehow, that made us bigger. In spring, Amelia turned 3. We threw a kind of party, just us as the sheriff and his wife who brought pie. Zoe baked bread, and I cooked meat on the fire pit. Amelia clapped for the candle's flame before blowing it out. Her wish, she said, was more sky. I figured that was as good a prayer as any. That night, after the guests rode home and the dishes were done, Zoe stood beside me on the porch. "She's growing fast," she said. "They do that," I answered. "You think she'll remember this?" "Maybe not the days," I said, "but she'll remember the feeling." She leaned into me, her head finding that place beneath my chin that fit like it had always belonged there. "Then we're doing all right." We were. The next summer brought drought. The creek shrank to a ribbon, and the fields cracked open like old hands. I rode farther for water each day, coming home with dust in my lungs and worry in my throat. Zoe worked harder than she should have, keeping the house cool, saving what we had. One evening, after I'd come in from the fields, I found her sitting on the porch steps, head bowed, Amelia asleep against her. The heat had finally broken, a storm building far off, thunder rolling like a slow drum. "Tired?" I asked her. "Just thinking," she said. "About what?" "How fragile it all is, how easy it could slip away." I sat beside her. "That's the thing about this land," I said. "It always looks like it's dying right before it comes back to life." She looked at me then, eyes shining in the lightning's brief flare. "You really believe that?" "I have to." The rain came that night, steady and sweet, soaking into the thirsty ground. By morning, the air smelled like forgiveness again. Zoe stood barefoot in the mud, face turned to the sky, and I watched her, knowing I'd follow that light for the rest of my life. As years folded into each other, the memories softened at the edges. The fear, the bruise, the silence, all of it faded, replaced by mornings of laughter and evenings of quiet content. Still, every so often, I'd wake before dawn, hear the wind whisper through the eaves, and remember that day at the stagecoach, the lavender, the bruise, the trembling hands. I'd reach for her then, half asleep, just to feel her there beside me, warm and breathing, and I'd whisper what I'd said all those years ago. "You're not alone now." And every time, even half dreaming, she'd answer, "Not ever again." The words never got old. They just settled deeper, the way roots find their way down through stone until they reach water. The summer Amelia turned 5. The world seemed brighter than it had any right to be. The cottonwood shimmered with new leaves, the air smelled of rain and smoke, and the fields swayed golden under a sun that refused to tire. It was the kind of season that makes a man think maybe God hadn't forgotten this corner of the world after all. Zoe spent her mornings in the garden, her hands deep in soil, teaching Amelia how to coax life from dirt. I'd watch from the porch, coffee in hand, the two of them bent over the rows like they were whispering to the earth itself. Every laugh that drifted up from the garden felt like a small miracle. Sometimes, though, I'd catch Zoe looking off toward the east, her eyes far away, like she was listening for something only she could hear. I never asked what it was. I'd learned a man doesn't always have to ask. Some silences deserve to stay whole. One evening, when the heat broke and the wind came down from the mountains, Zoe joined me on the porch. The light was soft, that copper hour when the land glows from within. Amelia was inside, humming herself to sleep with a tune Zoe used to hum when she thought no one was listening. Zoe sat quiet a while, then said, "Do you ever think we got lucky?" "Every day." "I don't mean that kind of lucky," she said. "I mean, Lucky to have been broken in ways that matched. I thought about it. Maybe that's all love is, two busted pieces that fit just right. She smiled, slow and knowing. Then I hope we never fit too perfect. I like the edges. We sat like that until the stars began to crowd the sky. The wind turned cool, brushing across her hair, carrying that faint lavender scent that still followed her after all these years. It hit me then how time had changed her. Stronger, steadier, but still carrying that softness she'd fought so hard to keep. When Amelia woke crying from a bad dream, Zoe went to her room. I listened from the doorway as she whispered the same words I'd once said on that dusty street in Silverdale. You're not alone now. Hearing them in her voice, softer but stronger, something inside me settled for good. Those words had started as a promise. Now they'd become a kind of inheritance. The next day, I rode into town for supplies. Silverdale hadn't changed much. Just a few new signs, a few more gray hairs on familiar heads. The saloon still leaned like a tired man. The church bell still rang late. When I walked into the store, the owner grinned. Well, if it ain't Nathaniel Reed, the man who tamed the edge of nowhere. Didn't tame it, I said. Just learned to live alongside it. He laughed, poured me a coffee, and said, Your wife's got a good name around here now. Folks say she's got a heart big enough to carry the whole valley. I nodded. How she carried me first. On the way home, the sky turned sudden dark, clouds piling up like fists. By the time I reached the ridge, thunder was rolling hard, and the rain came down in sheets. I found Zoe and Amelia on the porch, the girl squealing with delight, hands outstretched to catch the drops. Zoe's hair was plastered to her face, her eyes bright and wild with laughter. Thought I'd find you running for shelter, I called out. We are the shelter, she said, spinning once with Amelia in her arms. The rain's just visiting. I stood there, drenched and smiling, and realized she was right. The storm passed quick, leaving the air clean and electric. The sunset, after it was the kind that steals words right out of your throat. The sky burned in gold and violet, and the world smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. That night, after Amelia fell asleep, Zoe and I sat by the fire. She rested her head on my shoulder, and I traced small circles on her wrist where the skin was soft and warm. She's growing fast, I said. Too fast, Zoe whispered. Sometimes I wish I could hold time still for her. You can't, I said, but you can teach her to slow down enough to notice. Zoe looked up at me, eyes catching the firelight. You ever think about what she'll know of the world? She'll know what love sounds like, I said, and she'll know that the world ain't always kind, but it can be made kind if you stand your ground. Zoe smiled and closed her eyes. You make it sound simple. It ain't simple, I said, but it's true. Later, when the fire burned low, she whispered, Thank you. For what? For staying. I thought about that morning years ago, the stagecoach, the bruise, the way she couldn't meet my eyes. Back then, I thought I was saving her. But sitting there now, with her heartbeat against my shoulder, I knew the truth. She'd saved me right back. I kissed her forehead and said, Wasn't ever planning on leaving. She smiled in her sleep, and I watched the rise and fall of her breathing until the dawn crept through the window. The rooster crowed too early, as always, but I didn't mind. The sound meant we'd been granted another day to keep what we'd built. By morning, The world had washed itself clean again. The valley shone, fresh and forgiving. Zoe stood on the porch with Amelia in her arms, both of them bathed in that early light. And for a moment I thought, if heaven ever looked down, it would look exactly like this. And I found myself whispering it again, quiet but certain, just to the wind. You're not alone now, not ever again. Autumn settled in slow, laying its hand gentle across the valley. The cottonwoods turned gold, and the river moved lazy, thick with fallen leaves. Out here you can hear time passing if you're quiet enough. It sounds like wind through tall grass, like a gate swinging on its hinge, like your own breath when the world's finally still. Amelia started school that fall. The little one-room building stood at the edge of town, whitewashed and leaning, with a bell that never rang the same twice. I hitched the wagon that morning, packed her lunch in a tin, and tried to smile through the knot in my chest. Zoe fussed over her ribbon until the bow sat just right, though she kept blinking more than usual. Amelia climbed into the seat beside me, proud as any ranch hand, her feet not quite reaching the floorboard. You sure you're ready for this? I asked. She grinned, missing a front tooth. You sure you are, Papa? That made Zoe laugh, but her eyes shone wet. I kissed them both goodbye and drove her down the road, the wheels creaking in rhythm with the mare's hooves. When we reached the school, she hopped down, turned and waved. Don't worry, she said, I'll come back. I watched until the door closed behind her. The sound echoed in my chest longer than it should have. When I got home, Zoe was waiting on the porch. Well, she asked. She's braver than both of us, I said. She always has been, Zoe answered, and her voice carried pride wrapped in something softer, something that looked a lot like loss. The house felt too big that day. Every sound stretched thin, every silence louder than before. Zoe tried to keep busy, baking bread, sweeping floors that didn't need it, but I could see it in her shoulders, the ache of letting go just a little. By afternoon, she gave up pretending and sat by the window staring at the hills. I walked up behind her, rested a hand on her shoulder. She'll be home before supper, I said. I know, she whispered. It's just quiet. Quiet's not always empty, I said. Sometimes it's just making room for what comes next. When Amelia came running up the path that evening, hair tangled, cheeks flushed, we both exhaled the breath we didn't know we'd been holding. She told us about her teacher, about learning to write her name, about a boy who ate chalk on a dare. Zoe laughed until tears ran down her face, and I knew then that even the ache of watching a child grow was its own kind of grace. The years started to fold like pages in a well-read book. Amelia grew tall, her eyes bright as her mother's, and her will twice as strong. She learned to ride, to fish, to mend fences. She was part wild, part wonder. The land seemed to bend toward her, the way it does for those born under its sky. Zoe's hair began to show threads of silver by the time Amelia turned 10, but it only made her look more herself, like the world had finally caught up to her wisdom. She took to sketching in the evenings, filling pages with trees and faces and dreams she'd never spoken aloud. Sometimes she'd draw me without telling, and I'd find the sketches tucked between books or under the bread tin, as if she wanted to remind me that she saw me, even when I didn't see myself. One winter, when snow came late but heavy, Zoe fell ill. Nothing fierce at first, just a cough that wouldn't quit. I told her to rest, but she waved me off with that same stubborn tilt she'd had since the day we met. Still, the days stretched long, and the nights grew restless. One evening, she sat wrapped in a quilt by the fire, the lamplight soft on her face. "You remember that first night?" she asked, her voice low. "I remember every second," I said. "You told me I wasn't alone." "I meant it." She smiled faintly. "You kept your word." Her hand reached for mine, fingers thin but warm. "Promise me something," she said. "Anything. When she's grown, tell her everything. The truth. Not the story that sounds good. The truth." "I will," I said, "but you'll tell her yourself." She squeezed my hand. "Maybe, maybe not. Just make sure she knows that kindness ain't weakness, that sometimes staying is the bravest thing a soul can do." The fire popped. The wind pressed against the walls. I held her hand until her breathing evened out, and she drifted to sleep. Weeks passed. She grew stronger some days, weaker others. The doctor from town said it was her lungs, nothing to do but keep her warm and hopeful. So that's what we did, kept her wrapped in both. One morning, as the frost broke and the sky turned pink over the ridge, she stepped outside, leaning on my arm. The world was so still you could hear the snow melting. She looked out over the valley, that same look she'd had years before when she said it felt like freedom. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It always has been," I said. She turned her face toward me, the light soft on her skin. "Do you still believe we were meant to find each other?" I smiled. "I don't see how we could have missed." She laughed, a thin sound but full of life. "You always make it sound easy." "Maybe it was," I said, "after the hard part." She leaned her head against my shoulder, and we stood there until the cold chased us back inside. That night, after Amelia was asleep, I found Zoe writing by lamplight. She closed the notebook when she saw me, smiling, tired but true. "It's just letters," she said, "for her, for you. Saving words for later." Something like that. I didn't ask more. Some promises are meant to unfold on their own. When I blew out the lamp, I thought of the years behind us, the miles of silence, the laughter, the storms, the small mercies, and I realized healing doesn't have an end. It's a road you keep walking, step after step, until one day you look up and realize you're home. And that night, holding her hand beneath the quilt, listening to her breathing steady and light, I knew we'd made it all the way there. Winter broke early that year, like even the cold had grown tired. The snow melted from the roofs in long silver streaks, and the river started to hum again beneath the ice. Zoe's strength flickered back for a time, enough that she could walk to the porch and sit in the sun. Amelia would braid her hair and tell her about the day's chores, the world alive in her voice. Watching them together made me believe that maybe grace really did move in circles, finding its way back when you least expected it. Zoe's cough eased. Her color returned a little, and the sound of her laughter filled the house once more. But there was a weight behind her eyes, quiet and knowing, like someone who'd read the last page before the story was done. One evening she called me outside. The sunset was laying itself down soft across the hills, all gold and lavender. The air smelled like thawing earth. She wrapped her shawl tighter and said, "You ever notice how the sky looks different when it's about to let go?" I looked up, squinting at the line where light gave way to dark. "I suppose it does," she smiled. "I think everything does, right before it changes." We stood there a long while without talking. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of sage from the valley. She reached for my hand, fingers cold but steady. "If I go before you," she said, "don't build me a monument. Just keep the garden alive. That's all I want." "You're not going anywhere," I said. She looked up at me with that same quiet truth that first broke me open years ago. "We're all going somewhere, Nathaniel. Some of us just get to rest along the way." I wanted to argue, but her eyes stopped me. They held no fear, only peace, the kind that comes from having outrun your ghost. That night, after Amelia was asleep, we sat by the fire. She pulled her old notebook from the shelf, the one she'd filled over the years, and handed it to me. "You'll know when to give it to her," she said. The next few days blurred together, calm and soft. She slept more, spoke less. Sometimes she'd wake and ask me to read aloud from one of her favorite books. I'd read until her breathing fell into that rhythm I knew by heart, then keep reading anyway, my voice low and steady so she could carry the sound with her into dreams. On the morning she passed, the world was too still, the sky pale, the wind quiet. I'd stepped out to chop kindling when I heard Amelia's voice, small and unsure. "Papa," she called. When I came inside, Zoe was lying in bed, her hand resting open, the faintest smile still caught in the corner of her lips. The light through the curtain touched her face like it knew it was saying goodbye. Amelia stood beside her, eyes wide, not crying yet. I gathered her close, and we sat there until the sun climbed higher and the world started moving again. We buried her on the ridge overlooking the river, the same place she loved to stand when the wind came down from the north. The whole town showed up. Folks who'd once whispered now standing quiet, hats in their hands. The sheriff spoke a few words, simple and right. When it was done, I placed her shawl across the grave and whispered, "You're home now." That evening, after everyone had gone, Amelia and I sat by the fire. The house felt both full and hollow at once. She asked if Mama was really gone. "No," I told her. "She just went ahead a little ways." Amelia nodded, eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. "Will she still hear me when I talk to her?" "Every word," I said, "and you just talk soft so the wind can carry it." The days that followed moved quiet, like the world was catching its breath, and the chores helped. Work always does. Amelia stayed close, though she didn't cling. She had her mother's strength that way, gentle, but made of something that doesn't break. One night, maybe a month later, I was sitting on the porch when Amelia came out, holding the notebook Zoe had left. "Can I read it?" she asked. "Not yet," I said, "when you're ready." "I think I am." She opened it right there beside me. The pages were filled with Zoe's neat handwriting, letters to Amelia, stories, pieces of herself folded between ink and paper. Amelia read the first few lines aloud, her voice trembling. "My sweet girl, if you're reading this, it means you're old enough to understand that love isn't always about staying. Sometimes it's about knowing when to let go." She stopped reading then, pressed the book to her chest. I put my arm around her shoulders, and together we watched the stars rise. I don't know how long we sat like that. The night stretched wide and forgiving. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called. The river murmured below, same as always. "Papa," she said finally, "do you think Mama's proud of us?" "I know she is." "How?" "'Cause I can still feel her here," I said, touching my chest. and because every time you laugh, it sounds like her coming home." Amelia smiled through her tears. "Then I'll keep laughing." "You do that," I said. "She'll hear it." After she went to bed, I stayed by the fire until the logs burned low. The wind moved through the open window, carrying the faintest trace of lavender. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me. "Not alone now," I whispered. "Not ever." And for the first time since she left, I felt her answer, not in words, but in the warmth that filled the room, steady and sure, like the echo of a promise that never breaks. Years have a way of passing like wind through tall grass, quiet until you turn and realize half your life's behind you. Amelia grew up under that same wind. She learned the land the way some folks learn scripture, by living it, not just hearing it. The ranch became hers before either of us said it out loud. She moved through the fields with her mother's calm and my stubbornness, sunlight catching in her hair like it had a mind to stay. By the time she was 17, I'd gone gray and slower at the knees. She'd already outworked half the hands in the valley. She'd fix a broken gate before I could fetch a hammer, laugh about it after, and tell me not to act surprised. "You taught me to build things that hold," she'd say. I'd smile and tell her she'd built herself first. Every now and then, I'd catch her reading Zoe's old notebook, and some nights she'd bring it to the porch and read a few lines aloud. "Mama said love's the only thing you can give away and still have more of," she told me once. "You think that's true?" I nodded. "I know it." The world had changed around us. New roads, new families, the towns stretching farther down the river, but out here the rhythm stayed. Sun up, work, rest, repeat. And through it all, Zoe's garden kept blooming. Amelia made sure of that. Every spring she'd turn the soil herself, her hands covered in earth, humming the same tune her mother once did. Sometimes I'd walk out there just to watch her. From a distance, she looked so much like Zoe it made my chest ache. The same tilt of the head, the same way of standing still long enough to make the world come to her. She caught me watching once and smiled. "You're thinking about her again," she said, "always." Amelia walked over, dirt on her hands, and said, "She's proud of you, you know." I laughed soft. "If she is, it's because you made it easy for her." "No," she said, "it's because you kept your promise." That evening, a storm rolled in from the west, and the kind that makes the air hum before it breaks. We pulled the horses in, secured the barn doors, and sat on the porch while the sky cracked open. The rain came down in sheets, hard and sudden, washing dust from the roof, bringing that smell of wet earth and sage. Lightning danced across the hills, and thunder followed close behind. Amelia leaned forward, eyes bright. "Mama loved storms," she said. "She did," I answered. "Said they were proof the world still had a pulse." We sat there watching, the rain cooling the air, the land drinking deep. Somewhere in that roar, I felt her, Zoe, the memory of her laugh, the warmth she left behind. It didn't hurt anymore. It just lived there, easy as breathing. When the storm passed, the sky opened wide and full of stars. Amelia tilted her head back. "You think she can see us?" I took a long breath and let the smell of the night fill me. "She doesn't have to," I said. "She's part of it now." Amelia smiled. "Then I guess we're never really apart." "No," I said, "never." The next morning, sunlight spilled over the ridge, bright and forgiving. Amelia was already outside, her boots leaving prints in the soft ground. I stood at the window, watching her move through the garden, and it hit me how life keeps finding ways to start over, even when it doesn't owe you a thing. I walked out to her, the grass still wet beneath my boots. She looked up, wiping her hands on her apron. "You should have stayed inside," she said, ground still muddy. "I've walked through worse," she grinned. "I know." We planted the last row together that morning, seeds small enough to hide in a fingertip, yet holding a whole season's promise. When we finished, she brushed the dirt from her palms and looked at me. "Do you miss her less now?" "No," I said, "I just miss her quieter." The wind moved through the trees, gentle, patient. Somewhere down the hill, the river kept on singing its same old tune. I put an arm around Amelia's shoulders, and we stood there, both of us watching the light shift across the valley. "She used to say the land remembers kindness," I said. Amelia nodded. "Then it'll remember her forever." We turned to walk back to the house. On the porch, the rocking chair creaked, pushed by a wind that had nowhere particular to go. I could almost hear her there, Zoe humming, soft and low, the way she used to when the day was done. Inside, the fire waited, steady and warm. I poured 2 cups of coffee, one for me, one that I set by her photograph on the mantel. It wasn't habit, it was gratitude. When the sun dipped behind the ridge, and I sat down and let the quiet fill the room. Now the air smelled of lavender, just faint, just enough. I closed my eyes and spoke into it. "You're not alone now," I said, the words falling easy, worn smooth by years of use. And somewhere in the hush, in the creak of the boards and the sigh of the wind, I heard it come back to me, soft and sure. "Not ever again." The house settled around the sound. The fire whispered low, and the world, old and kind, kept turning.